Welcome back to another magazine flick through. It's been 3 years since I did the last one of these, so we're back on to the next issue of Edge, and it's August 1994, and the feature this month is the launch of the PSX, or PlayStation, as it was known. It's interesting if you look at the formats that are being covered here. So you've got Sony, obviously PlayStation, Saturn, Nintendo. The N64 wasn't out yet, but you've got Amiga PC, Atari, SNK with a Neo Geo. So at this point, you've still got that middle generation of the 3DO, the Jaguar, the CDI, the Amiga CD32, all trying to compete before this proper next generation really happened with the PS1, the Saturn, and the N64. So it's interesting to see at this point how Edge thought this was going to pan out. So let's open this up. Yeah, multimedia is dead, long live the PlayStation. Just picking up on a few sentences here, it's clear that the idea of having FMV, using a CD-ROM to read large video files, that had a limited amount of gameplay you could get from those games, and that 3D was really the next big thing. I think looking at the arcades, the PlayStation was a lot closer to what we had there, and it really had that great combination of, you got the CD if you need it for the large game sizes, but you've also got the 3D processor and the great sound. So it's clear that the PlayStation, the Saturn, and later the N64 were going to be the next big thing. Just looking at some of the games in here. I deliberately haven't gone through this issue. I'm trying to look at this for the first time. Stunt Race FX, that is a very good game for the SNES. So it's interesting to see that the SNES and the Mega Drive were still the current consoles, and it's easy to forget by looking at Edge that they still existed at times. So this is the Tokyo Toy Show in '94. Obviously Sega, you can see the version of Daytona there. That looks like a pre-release screenshot. I don't recognise that as any of the tracks. And Virtua Fighter, they're saying that it's still only 30% complete. The Saturn was launched earlier than it should have been. It was rushed somewhat. Well, at least the launch was. And there are various documentaries and accounts out there, but a lot of the games really needed a little bit longer to bake on the hardware. But it's a lovely looking machine. In a way, I think I prefer the Japanese look to the European black console. I think it looks, I think now, yes, it looks a little bit like a toy in a way, but then that would have looked really, really sleek in that aesthetic. It's interesting looking at the PlayStation and the Saturn that they're these big plastic things, whereas the PlayStation 2 and perhaps even just the PlayStation 2 went for more of it was more of like a hi-fi look, whereas I think the Dreamcast and the Xbox 360, those machines still went for that sort of like new, I don't want to use the word toy, but if that makes sense, it's more like a consumer thing rather than a VCR, like the CDI, for example. So we've got Panzer Dragoon. Obviously a lot of launch games on the Saturn. PlayStation, Neo Geo CD. I forgot about that console. I mean, the Neo Geo really kept that hardware for such a long time, from your early Neo Geo games right until, I think it was King of Fighters 2002, was still using roughly the same hardware, so they'd added the CD on it. It's just a shame the drive wasn't a little bit faster, but that certainly brought the price down. It's interesting, the NEC FX, which was the 32-bit follow-up to the PC Engine, which had a CD on it. But if you look at the hardware, it's almost like a PC tower in a way. So a very, very different aesthetic. I think even better picture there. You can see that the companies were trying to move into something that looked either a bit more like a a PC or something that was more VCR like, with the CDTV starting that trend off. It's a shame this didn't really take off. The PC Engine was a interesting machine. It came out between the Master System and the Mega Drive, and the hardware was somewhere in the middle. But it just didn't really progress beyond that. There was I think it was the Super Graphics, which was the souped up version of the PC Engine, but there was very limited game support on that, and this just didn't take off. I think by the time the FX came around, there were just too many machines in the market. But at the same time, you've got PC cards here, and the 3D accelerators were not very far away. That PC gaming really took off at the time. I remember losing interest in consoles and really getting more into PCs, and just the DOS games at that time, following up from games like Doom and then later Quake, really were paving the way forwards. The PC took off so much better from before, going from CGA to VGA, so you're starting to get these great text adventure games and making good use of the CD-ROM format. So what have we got here? Yeah, the 3DO. It had some good 3D games, Road Rash, Need for Speed. It was a good platform, it just had a little bit limited support. Obviously Electronic Arts were all behind it. The 32X there. It's just amazing to see how crowded this is. It really is. Interesting to look at the hardware in that. So they're looking at how many polygons per second. There were very few games on the 32X and the Jaguar, and maybe even the 3DO to an extent, that were fully texture map polygons. They did exist, but we were still quite away from what we were seeing in the arcades at that point. So you get your subscriptions. I quite like one of those. You could probably get them on eBay, but I'm being good and I'm not buying more stuff unless I absolutely need it. So being a parent, you've got to think a little bit carefully about space and money and time. So what have we got here? Yeah, Virtua Fighter, Wing Commander. That was a good game. It's interesting with the SNES that SNES games were still being featured, but when you look at what was being shown in the next generation, they do look very, I won't say dated, but there's a big gap between what we're seeing in, say, 11th hour. I know that this is pre-rendered, but you compare that to what's being shown on the Mega Drive and SNES, and there's a big difference there. I don't know very much about this game. I know the PC. Oh, actually, this is the PC version. I remember it being a good showcase for the CD-ROM format, along with Seventh Guest, which is also mentioned here. So according to that, it's the sequel. I was never really sure what the relationship was. That's scary. Virtua Fighter. Okay. Now this is interesting. On the left it says Virtua Fighter is only 30% complete, but look at these ones on the right. These are described as being 10% complete, but they look very, I don't know if it shows on the video, but they look quite high res. They look like mock-ups in a way. They don't look like they've been rendered on the Saturn in its 320 by 240 resolution. They look a lot higher. So I'm curious to see what those were. It's talking about the hardware, saying that the Model 1 could push 180,000 polygons a second, and the Saturn was a lot less, which is interesting when you compare Model 1 and Model 2, that Model 2 was really what the Saturn was trying to position itself as, with games like Virtua Racing and Sega Rally, for example. So it's interesting here saying that it was having trouble with even Virtua Fighter. Yeah, even with a reduced number of polygons, the Saturn is capable of applying textures, and this did happen with the Virtua Fighter Remix, which was a more complete game, more finished game than the original. Don't know much about this one. It's interesting that a lot of these games start to look the same through modern eyes. They're a bit much of a muchness, not including this, obviously. Wing Commander 3. This was a great game on the PC, and it had conversions to the 3DO and the PlayStation 1. Really good use of FMV being used to tell a story, and it has Mark Hamill and Rhys Davis in there. Really good use of the format, and you've got this genuine 3D space sections that were quite a big step up from the first two Wing Commander games that used scaled sprites, and this really was a good sign of where things were going. It's a really good game, and Wing Commander 4 was good as well, quite similar. Super Street Fighter 2 on the SNES, 32 megabit. It's interesting to think back that there were a lot of versions of Street Fighter 2 that came out, but when you look back on compilation discs now, were there really? Maybe there was a version every year, but is that much different to a sports game? I don't know. It's a good game. Good game on the SNES. The D-pad is really well suited. Advert for 3DO PlayStation. Yeah. So this was the deal between PlayStation and Nintendo. I didn't realise it was 1988. I didn't realise it was that far back. But there's a long history with it that Nintendo and Sony parted ways, and the prototype that was called the PlayStation for the CD add-on has surfaced. So they do exist. I think one exists, if I remember correctly. But Sony went ahead and just built a console and brought this brilliant machine that was very much further ahead than hardware at the time. And I know there are discussions which was a better machine, the Saturn or the PlayStation, but the PlayStation was that much easier to program for that you just saw these great titles. And sure, there are arguments about the Saturn being more powerful on paper, but just the talent needed to program that was quite a big differentiator between them. I like the Saturn as well, just as much. What games have we got here? Wildtrax. Oh, Circus Grand Prix. This is by Polyphony. This is the game that eventually became, or at least the engine that became, Gran Turismo. They released this game, and then the next follow-up was Gran Turismo, which was just such a great start for simulation games in this era. So Namco, obviously a big supporter of the PlayStation 1 at the time. They did later release games on the Dreamcast, games like Soul Calibur, but if you wanted Ridge Racer and you wanted your Namco games, you needed a PlayStation. As with Sega games, you needed a Saturn. Capcom, yeah, obviously a lot of conversions, but the Street Fighter games did get conversions to the Saturn and the PlayStation 1. They were both very good machines for 2D beat-em-ups. I mean, the Saturn had that extra 4 meg cartridge, so it had really good animation, as did the Neo Geo games. But the PlayStation certainly, the games were certainly not bad. They didn't quite have the animation, but they were, for the most part, decent conversions, particularly the Street Fighter games. CDI, yeah. I'm looking at you, Dave Price. It's interesting that there's a relationship between the CDI and the PlayStation that Nintendo then, once they fell out with Sony, backed Philips, and this machine came out that had a few cross licenses with Nintendo IP. but not much really came out of that. I don't know who developed the games, but it certainly wasn't Nintendo. Yeah, they're quite volatile, these machines. There's a chip in there that has a battery clock, clock battery, and once the battery dies, you can't boot the machine up, so it's quite difficult to replace that chip for the battery. But you can see, looking at the machine, going back to what I was saying before, this looks professional. It looks like a VCR or a DVD player, and certainly with your MPEG 1 video cartridge for your video discs, video CDs. I think it's probably better to view this as a VCD player that plays games rather than a games console in its own right. It was certainly quite limited, but for the video quality, for the ones that supported the MPEG card, really nice video, and that was its strength. There are some good games that use FMV, but not that many. Test screen. So what games have we got coming out? Oh yeah, good games. Theme Park. It's amazing to think that this came out so late in the decade. This is on PC, but I always remember this coming out on the Amiga first. I might be wrong. There were a couple of versions. There was an OCS, ECS version and an AGA version, and I remember the Jaguar version looking a lot like the AGA one, and really nice looking games. Obviously it got ported to Mega Drive and SNES. 8 out of 10. Yeah, such a good game. It's just Peter Molyneux's team just getting that right from the beginning. And I remember playing this at the time and not being very good at it, and looking back now, the objective of the game is to run a business. It's not to build a really cool park. And you look back now and you go, oh, okay, that's how you play the game. You make as much money as possible, and that's how you win. You don't go bankrupt by building this giant cool park. Super Sidekicks, Neo Geo game. It's hard to tell from these screenshots whether that's like a Mode 7 style effect, but I don't remember the Neo Geo having that kind of effect. I know it had various scaling tricks, but without seeing that in motion. Wildtrax. Yeah, so this is stunt race effects on the SNES. This was a Super FX game. It's a really nice looking game, and it's a lot more varied. The tracks are a lot more varied than Virtua Racing. I mean, this is where the comparison comes in, with Virtua Racing coming out on the Mega Drive at roughly the same time. But the thing that was such a letdown for this game, I really enjoy it. I like the controls. I'm sure if you go back now, not everyone will, but it used the Super FX1, and it's just a shame that it didn't come out a little bit later and use the Super FX2, because the frame rate isn't great and it's not quite full screen. And I do wonder if it's possible to fix some of that in an emulator without making the game run too fast, so the game clocks faster, so it's got more frames per second. I'm not sure. There probably is some experimentation out there. It's interesting looking here. It talks about texture mapping, and even you see it on there, the FX, that the Super FX was capable of a little bit of texture mapping here and there. Even that fence, you can see the warping on it where it's clipping. Yeah, really impressive bit of hardware with the Super FX, and this was such an ambitious game, with following up from Star Fox, that it has so much personality in there, and it has quite a bit of longevity in there. Yeah, 9 out of 10, they did like it. Yeah, so the same, Virtua Racing is a great 2-player game, but it's restricted 1-player mode. Yeah, that was a bit of a problem. You had those 3 tracks, which are good and they are challenging, but you can beat the game relatively quickly. Dr. Hauzer. This looks a lot like Alone in the Dark. Don't know much about it. I'm sure I've mentioned this game before. It does look familiar. Must have been a preview. It's expensive on the import though, £60. And that's in 1994's money. does looks like it's real-time 3D. I might be wrong on that. You can see from the quality of it. I don't know if that's just a Resident Evil style pre-rendered background or whether it's real-time. If it was, that would be impressive for the 3DO. 7 out of 10. So what have we got on here? Yeah, obviously Mega Drive. Classic games. Super Monaco. Virtua Racing, $57.99. So that has dropped by just over a tenner at that point. I forget exactly when in '94 the game came out, but that must have dropped pretty quickly. Special Reserve. Yeah, I did order from them once or twice, but it's amazing to think back now that pretty much any game you want, you can get it. You can go on Amazon, you can go on eBay, you can go on various online stores, and you can look them up and try and find the games. Whereas at that point, if your game shop didn't have it, you could try the market, or you could try various physical shops to find the games. But this is almost your equivalent of online shopping, isn't it? Because you place your order and state the price, check they've got the game in stock, and you order it. So in a way, it's not that different from online shopping. It just takes, does it take longer? If you phone them up, it's not much different, is it? You still got to post it. Out of This World, Another World, 3DO. This looks quite different than the Amiga version, the Atari ST version. I think they've redrawn it. It looks nice. It does look really nice. I forget who coded this. Whether it was Rebecca Heinemann, who did the Jaguar... No, sorry, that's rubbish. The 3DO version of Doom and Wolfenstein. And she did do some work with Out of This World to the... It was some of the 8-bit machines, the Apple II, or was it the Apple II GS? I think maybe the SNES version as well. I don't know if she was involved with this one or not. It'd be interesting to look back at that video. There's quite a lot of depth in there. There's like a big review, or like overview that she gave of a number of games that were developed. It's well worth having a look. Battlecorps, or Battlecorps, on the Mega CD. So this is a game that it's interesting to give it 6 out of 10. I was really impressed by the Mode 7 style effect, and you've got sprite scaling, which is a little different than the SNES. The SNES can't scale sprites or rotate them. It's just that background layer. So in games like Super Contra, you get that aeroplane at the beginning that flies into the screen. It's just one item. It's the Mode 7. But the Mega CD had both, and that was really cool. And Soulstar, great game. It's one of my all-time favourites. Thunderhawk is good. It's a difficult game, but I was really impressed with it. Whereas Battlecorps, it's a game that I really want to like, and I do go back to it now and again. But it's just, I don't know what it is. Whether it's the viewport's too small or the angle's a little bit shallow, but it's not quite as I don't know. How is it not quite as polished? But I don't know. It's not quite as much fun. It's a very difficult game, but visually, of course, impressive. Very impressive. Super Play. I've got a couple of issues of that. I'm trying to go through these in chronological order. I ordered magazines years back, and I've now got some earlier Mean Machines and some issues of Super Play and Games Master, but instead of going back, I'm just going to I'll go to the end, cover the Edge Sega Saturn magazine, and then start from the beginning and just fill in the gaps. Yeah, TIE Fighter Wars. There were a number of Star Wars games. Was it X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, I think was the first one. But it's interesting that Star Wars was starting to get attention again before the re-release of the special editions in '97, and of course the prequels. Letters page. Okay, Stunt Car Racer Retro View. Interesting going back and looking at some of these older games which were considered retro. at that time. It's difficult to oh yeah, interesting. PC Engine just caught my eye there. Expensive. But it's interesting to consider what is retro. Even now that the question's being asked, that is it something that's 10 years old? Is it something that's a generation or 2 generations behind? It's difficult to classify it. So what are the readers wanting? Labyrinth. Never heard of that game. Don't know much about it. Did it even come out? I don't know. Maybe it changed its name. Or was it Daytona? And Ridge Racer. They were so popular at the arcade at the times. It really was an easy sell. You know, just getting those converted over to the new consoles. I covered that. Heavenly Symphony. I forget the name. The US version has a different name. I think, is it F1 Beyond the Limit? I think it was called. But that's an impressive 3D game on the Mega CD. Interesting looking at the recruitment in here. Edge always positioned itself as an industry magazine. Rare. What would they have been making at the time? Donkey Kong Country, I think, was out at that point, or close to being released. 3D modelers. Must be N64. Nick Alexander. He was in a recent documentary. I forget which one it was. Virgin Games, Virgin Media in the UK. They released quite a few decent games after the Disney games left Sega. I think it was Virgin, if I remember correctly. Yeah, getting towards the end now. Oh, West Yorkshire, Jaguar, Atari Specialist. So what have we got near? Oh, this was the Neo Geo MVFZ1. Was that the upgrade? There was a Neo Geo machine that did a little bit of 3D, but I don't remember what happened to it. Right, and that's it. Oh, next month, CES. So what is it? What is that? Nintendo Project Reality. Yeah, the N64. So the PlayStation came out relatively quickly, but the N64 took a lot longer to get released. So it's interesting to see how that machine was being shown off, just particularly as the PlayStation and Saturn, you could always compare it to the arcades, whereas the Nintendo had a very different set of games. And it did have a couple of arcade games, but looking at the silicon graphics at the time, they were quite different than the games that we actually got in the end. Right, so I'll leave it there. It's interesting looking back at this issue. It's quite a dry one in a way. I do wonder at the time, without the benefit of hindsight, whether this would have looked like a great view into the future, what was coming up the next generation, or whether it would have just been confusing. It's interesting that there isn't a lot of coverage of the Mega Drive and the SNES, other than a couple of games here and there. Street Fighter, Wildtrax effects, and what was the other one? Demon's Crest, was it? It's only 3 games. So it's interesting to think that the Mega Drive and SNES were looking a little long in the tooth, and I could see why as an owner at the time the 32X would have been quite attractive, because it means you can get this new experience of the 32-bit machines without paying a ridiculous amount of cash at the time, but it never quite panned out, although you did get Doom, which was pretty good, and Virtua Racing Deluxe. Anyway, I'm waffling, so thank you very much for watching, and next time I'll be back with the September '94 issue, looking mainly at the N64 and what's coming around the corner.